The freshman was never the kind of boy people expected to remember. He was neither the loudest in the room, nor the one to draw eyes when he walked into a hallway. His shirts were pressed but plain, his shoes scuffed but serviceable, and his hair, kept short out of habit, always seemed one day behind needing a trim. To his classmates, he was simply another young man trying to make sense of college life, balancing too many assignments with too little sleep. Professors saw a quiet student who turned in work on time, nodded politely during lectures, and faded into the background when louder voices filled the air. He wasn't ordinary out of weakness. He was ordinary because he never sought to be otherwise. The campus buzzed with the energy of young lives still untested by the world. The year was 1941, and though the United States had not yet entered the war raging across Europe and Asia, whispers of it curled through every conversation like cigarette smoke. Radios in dormitories crackled with news reports of bombings overseas, of leaders making speeches, of men his age already fighting on distant soil. Some students scoffed, dismissing it all as another man's war, something that would fade before it reached their shores. Others argued fiercely in dining halls, declaring it only a matter of time before America was drawn in. But for him, the war was little more than a shadow at the edge of his life. His mornings began with coffee too weak to keep him fully awake, lectures that droned on with the rhythm of chalk against blackboard, and afternoons spent hunched in the library with books stacked like barricades around him. He had grown up in a small town where the most dangerous thing he'd ever faced was a stubborn storm flooding the riverbanks. Now, he was in a world larger than he had ever known, a campus teeming with ideas, debates, and possibilities. To his friends, he was the dependable one. When someone needed notes from a missed class, they came to him. When another ran out of money for lunch, he shared his meal without complaint. He laughed easily at jokes, even the ones made at his expense, and spoke with a gentleness that made people trust him. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lay a restlessness he couldn't explain. At night, lying awake in his narrow dormitory bed, he often stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of something unnamed pressing on his chest. There was a sense, though he couldn't have put it into words, that his life, as it was waiting for something to happen. The signs of a changing world weren't hard to see. Posters lined city streets with patriotic slogans, urging young men to be ready, to be strong, to prepare themselves for duty. Newspapers carried headlines of destruction abroad, black and white photographs of ruins that seemed impossibly far from the green lawns and red brick buildings of his campus. Letters arrived for some of his classmates, older brothers already enlisted, fathers worried about what was coming. A few of the more eager boys even boasted about wanting to fight, turning bravado into a mask for their fear. He listened but rarely spoke. It wasn't that he was indifferent. On the contrary, he felt each story carve its mark deeper into his thoughts. But what could he do? He was just 19, with exams to pass and a future still being scribbled out in half-formed plans. His dream was simple: graduate, find steady work, maybe return to his hometown and build something lasting. War was for other men braver and stronger than he was, or so he believed. On weekends, when the weather was kind, he'd sit beneath an oak tree with a notebook, sketching words that never quite formed into poems and doodles that never quite looked like anything at all. Sometimes he'd watch the military cadets from a nearby training school marching in neat rows across the field. Their movements were sharp, precise, almost mechanical, and he wondered if he could ever match such discipline. He shook his head, smiling at the thought. He was meant for books, not rifles. At least, that was what everyone told him, including himself. Yet even then, small moments betrayed the truth he hadn't recognized. There was the time a classmate fainted during a lecture, and while others froze in confusion, he leapt forward, catching her before she hit the floor. Calmly, he loosened her collar, checked her breathing, and sent someone sprinting for help. When the professor praised him afterward, he only shrugged and muttered. Anyone would have done the same. But deep down, he knew that wasn't quite true. There was another time, during a late-night walk back from the library, when he found a younger student being harassed by 3 older boys. Without thinking, he stepped in. He wasn't larger, nor particularly intimidating, but the steadiness in his voice and the unwavering look in his eyes made the bullies step back. The younger student never forgot it, though the freshman brushed it off as nothing. Each of these small acts slipped by unnoticed by most, but they were glimpses, brief flashes of steel beneath the quiet surface. December came, and with it, a sharpness in the air. Snow dusted the campus, and holiday decorations brightened the dormitory halls. Students spoke of going home, of feasts and families waiting. He looked forward to it too, yet the shadow of war was growing larger, creeping closer. Newspapers screamed louder now. Britain was desperate, Germany relentless, Japan restless. The freshman read the headlines with the same sense of unease he had carried for months, though he still told himself it wasn't his fight. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. He was in the library, hunched over a history book, when the announcement broke through the building like thunder. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. America was at war. The room went silent first, then erupted with chaos, students rushing to radios, voices rising in panic, confusion, anger. Some shouted promises of revenge, others argued what it would mean. He sat frozen, the words sinking into him with a weight unlike anything he'd felt before. This wasn't a distant war anymore. This was real. This was here. That night, as he walked across campus beneath the frozen stars, the air seemed sharper, heavier. Posters calling for enlistment appeared almost overnight, their bold letters impossible to ignore. Men his age boys really spoke of joining, of proving themselves, of fighting for their country. And though fear knotted his stomach, he felt something else burning just as fiercely. A sense that this, whatever it was the very thing he had been waiting for without knowing it. The freshman didn't know it yet, but history had already reached for him. He was no longer just another boy in a classroom. He was standing at the threshold of a story far greater than himself, one that would strip away the ordinary and reveal the soldier hidden within. For now, though, he remained what he had always been, a student walking across a quiet campus, his breath rising in the cold night, unaware that the world he knew was ending, and another was about to begin. The winter wind cut through the campus like glass, carrying with it a sharpness that mirrored the mood of the nation. Gone were the lazy debates in lecture halls about whether America should or should not join the war. Pearl Harbor had silenced those arguments. Now, the only question that lingered in dormitories, classrooms, and cafeterias was, when will it touch us next? Recruitment posters multiplied like ivy across the brick walls of the college buildings. Uncle Sam wants you. Defend freedom. Enlist today. Every corner he turned seemed to stare back at him with painted eyes and pointed fingers. Students who once buried themselves in books now whispered about enlistment. Some packed their bags without a word, leaving empty beds behind. Others bragged loudly about going to fight, though most had not yet taken a single step toward the recruiter's office. The freshman walked among them silently, carrying his books as though they might shield him from the pull of those posters. Inside, however, the words gnawed at him. They want you? Not the boy sitting next to him in chemistry class. Not the loud-mouthed braggart across the hall. Him. It was late January when the recruiters arrived. They came unannounced, stepping onto campus in uniforms so sharp and pressed that students stopped mid-conversation just to watch. The officers walked with a precision that commanded attention, their boots clicking against the cobblestones as if striking a drumbeat. For a campus where most young men still wore rumpled sweaters and scuffed shoes, the sight was magnetic. The freshman noticed immediately. He was sitting on the steps outside the library, notebook balanced on his knees, when he saw them cross the quad. A hush fell around them. Some students averted their eyes, fearful of being called out. Others straightened, pretending to look braver than they felt. But he didn't look away. He found his gaze fixed on the recruiters, studying the crisp lines of their coats, the calm authority in their posture, the quiet weight they carried. One of the officers noticed. "Son," the man called, his voice carrying without effort. The freshman's head jerked up, startled. His classmates nearby chuckled, whispering under their breath. The officer walked toward him, his polished boots striking the stone with confidence. "You ever considered serving your country?" It was such a simple question, yet it landed like a stone in the freshman's chest. He stammered, fumbling for words. I'm just a student, sir." The officer studied him for a long moment, as though weighing more than his answer. There was no mockery in the man's eyes, only a kind of knowing, as if he had asked the same question to hundreds before him, and recognized hesitation for what it truly was, fear mixed with duty. "You look steady," the officer said finally. "Not all of them are." Behind the freshman, laughter erupted. One boy muttered, "Steady? Him? He probably can't even march in a straight line." The jeers drew a flush to his face, but the officer ignored them. Instead, he placed a hand on the freshman's shoulder, firm but not unkind. "Think about it," he said quietly. Then, with a nod, he moved on. The freshman sat frozen, his notebook forgotten. His heart pounded as if he had just run across the field. He wanted to laugh it off, to tell himself the recruiter had only stopped because he was sitting in plain sight. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the words were meant for him. "You look steady." That night, in the dormitory, the encounter became the subject of teasing. His friends reenacted the moment, mocking the way he had stammered. "Imagine him in a helmet," one joked. "He'd trip over his own boots before he made it out the door." The room erupted in laughter. He forced a smile, but the words stung more than he wanted to admit. Still, beneath the sting, there was a flicker of something else in Emmer. He replayed the officer's words over and over in his head. Not the laughter of his classmates, not the jeers. Just that one phrase, "You look steady." It was such a small thing, yet it had pierced straight through him, cutting past doubt and landing somewhere deep. In the weeks that followed, he found himself noticing details he had ignored before. The recruiters set up a booth near the main square, where pamphlets fluttered in the cold wind. He avoided walking directly past, but his eyes always drifted toward them. He overheard conversations of students debating whether to enlist, some fueled by pride, others by desperation. Letters from the front lines, written by brothers or cousins, or read aloud in the cafeteria, their words heavy with both fear and courage. And slowly, the freshman realized he was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the comfort of classrooms, textbooks, and the predictable rhythm of exams. The other stretched into unknown terrain, lined with danger, hardship, and sacrifice. He told himself he wasn't ready, that he was too young, too inexperienced. Yet, when he looked around at the boys boasting about joining, he couldn't shake the thought that most of them were no more prepared than he was. It was late one evening when the decision began to crystallize. He had been walking across campus after a study session, the moon pale against the winter sky. In the distance, he saw the recruiters again, this time speaking with a group of eager students. Their faces glowed with a mix of nerves and excitement, like moths drawn to flame. The freshman paused, watching from the shadows. For a long time, he stood there, torn between stepping forward and walking away. His breath clouded in the cold, each exhale carrying a question he couldn't answer. Finally, the group dispersed, and the recruiters packed their things. One of them glanced in his direction, catching his eye across the empty quad. The officer gave a small nod. Nothing more. Just a nod as if to say, "You'll know when it's time." The freshman's chest tightened. He turned and walked quickly back to the dormitory, heart hammering. He didn't sleep that night. Days stretched into weeks, and though he went through the motions of lectures and assignments, his mind was elsewhere. Every slam of a newspaper onto a cafe table, every radio broadcast echoing through the dormitory, every whispered rumor of attacks or troop movements seemed to pull him closer to a decision. And then, one afternoon, as snow melted into slush and the first hints of spring crept into the air, he found himself standing in front of the recruiter's booth. He hadn't planned to. He had been on his way to class, books under his arm, when his steps slowed, then stopped. The officer behind the booth looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You again," the man said, smiling faintly. "Finally ready to talk?" The freshman swallowed hard, shifting the books in his arms. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "Maybe I am." The officer leaned forward, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Then let's find out what you're made of." At that moment, surrounded by pamphlets, posters, and the noise of students hurrying past, the freshman felt the world tilt. He had not signed his name yet. He had not sworn an oath, nor boarded a train, nor touched a rifle. But something inside him shifted. He was no longer just a boy with books and half-formed dreams. The war had reached him, pulled him into its orbit. And though he didn't yet know the shape of the man he would become, he sensed perhaps for the first time that his ordinary life was ending. History had called, and he had answered. The decision weighed on him long before ink ever touched paper. Every night, the war crept into his dreamed soldiers trudging through mud, faces shadowed by helmets, ships lit by fire against a dark horizon. He would wake in his narrow dorm bed, heart racing, the silence of the campus pressing down on him like a burden. During the day, he wore the mask of a student, taking notes, walking to class, laughing when others laughed. But behind that mask, a battle raged. At home, his family had already heard the news. Letters arrived, filled with worry and pleas. His mother's handwriting trembled across the page, begging him to think of his future. "Stay in school. Stay safe. The war will end one day, but your life is only beginning." His father's words were fewer, but heavier. "Do not waste what you've been given. A mind like yours belongs in classrooms, not trenches." He read the letters late at night by the glow of a desk lamp. Each word pulled him in a different direction. One voice cried for safety. Another demanded courage. And in between them, he sat trapped, just a boy, 19 years old, asked to decide not just his own fate, but the shape of his family's future. On campus, the noise grew louder. Recruitment numbers were posted weekly, names of classmates added to the lists. Empty beds in dorm rooms multiplied. Sometimes he'd walk into a classroom and see whole rows missing. Professors paused lectures, their eyes lingering on the gaps before pressing forward. The war had begun to hollow out the campus like a tree eaten from within. And still, he hesitated. His friends mocked him for it. Not cruelly at first, but with the kind of careless humor young men use to hide their own fear. "Still thinking, huh?" One said over lunch, stabbing at his food with a fork. "You'll think so long the war'll be over before you decide." Another chimed in. "Maybe that's the plan, hide in the library until Hitler surrenders." Laughter followed, but it landed sharp against his chest. He forced a smile, but inside, doubt dug deeper. The truth was, he wasn't afraid of dying, at least, not in the way he admitted to himself. What terrified him was failing. What if he enlisted and proved his friends right? What if he stumbled during training, collapsed under weight, broke under pressure? What if he became a burden instead of a soldier? That fear gnawed at him, whispering that he wasn't made of the same steel as the men already marching off to war. But then came the night that shifted everything. He was walking back from the library, the quad empty under a pale moon. In the distance, he heard voices angry, sharp. Rounding the corner, he saw two older students shoving a younger boy against a wall, mocking him for being too small to enlist. "Run home to your mama," one sneered, pushing the boy's books to the ground. The freshman froze, torn between retreat and action. His heart hammered. Then, without thinking, he stepped forward. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice steady though his palms sweated. The two older boys turned, sneering. "And what are you going to do about it?" He didn't flinch. He stood taller, eyes locked on theirs. Silence stretched. Finally, with a scoff, they shoved past him, muttering insults as they disappeared into the dark. The younger boy bent to gather his books, hands trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. The freshman only nodded, but as he walked away, a realization struck him. He had faced the same fear that haunted him, the fear of failing, and found himself standing firm. He hadn't crumbled. He hadn't run. He had stepped forward. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Maybe courage wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about standing steady, even when fear clawed at your chest. The next morning, he went to see the recruiters. The office smelled faintly of ink and leather, the walls lined with posters. Behind a desk sat an officer, the same man who had first spoken to him weeks earlier. The officer looked up, recognition flashing in his eyes. "You've been circling long enough," the man said. "Ready to decide?" The freshman swallowed. "I think so." The officer slid a paper across the desk. "This is your line in the sand. Once you sign, there's no going back." The pen felt heavy in his hand. He thought of his mother's tears, his father's silence, his friends' laughter. He thought of the boy he had defended the night before, and the steadiness that had surprised even himself. His hand shook once, just once, before he pressed the pen to paper. His name formed slowly, letter by letter, until it was done. He set the pen down and exhaled. The officer smiled faintly. "Welcome, son. You just crossed the threshold." Walking out of the office, he felt lighter and heavier all at once. The decision that had haunted him for months was finally made. Yet, with it came the weight of everything that lay ahead. The books he carried to class no longer seemed like shields, but relics of a life he had just left behind. That evening, he sat at his desk and wrote home. His letter was careful, deliberate. To his mother, he promised to write often. To his father, he promised to serve with honor. To both, he promised to return. But as he sealed the envelope, he whispered words only to himself. "I hope I'm enough." In the days that followed, whispers spread across campus. "He signed up," they said, disbelief in their voices. Some shook their heads, calling him foolish. Others offered nods of respect. The freshman ignored it all. He had made his choice. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for history to happen to him. He had stepped forward into it. He was still afraid. But now, his fear had a purpose. And with that purpose, the ordinary freshman began his journey to become the soldier they didn't yet know they needed most. The train ride to camp rattled like a drum, each clack of the wheels against the rails, carrying him farther from the life he had known. Around him, young men filled the compartments, some laughing too loudly, others sitting stiff with nerves, a few staring out windows as if memorizing the world they were leaving behind. He clutched the small suitcase on his lap, packed with the last remnants of his college days. A worn notebook, a fountain pen, and a photograph of his family. The campus felt a lifetime away already. There were no books to hide behind here, no quiet libraries or friendly professors to guide him. Ahead lay a world stripped of comfort, built on sweat, mud, and command. When the train screeched to a halt, the recruits spilled onto the platform like cattle. Arced orders cut through the cold air, sharp as whips. "Line up! Move it!" Men in uniforms prowled the platform, eyes hard, voices relentless. The freshman moved quickly, trying to keep his footing as they were herded into formation. His heart thudded in his chest, but he forced his shoulders back, his chin up. Boot camp began before the sun had fully risen. Days blurred into one another, stitched together by exhaustion. Reveille split the silence each morning, and before he had rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he was running across frozen fields, boots pounding the earth. The air smelled of sweat and dust, of gun oil and damp wool. Instructors shouted until their throats were raw, their words designed to strip away hesitation and excuse. At first, he stumbled. He lagged behind on runs, his legs burning. He fumbled with his rifle, his fingers clumsy against cold metal. He tripped climbing over walls, sprawled face first in mud, while others vaulted cleanly. Each mistake drew a storm of insults, the instructors circling like hawks. "Too soft." They barked. "This isn't a classroom, boy." The freshman bit his tongue and pushed forward. He refused to let the mud claim him. In the mess hall, he sat in silence, spooning thin stew into his mouth, while others boasted of hometowns, sweethearts, or imagined glories. He listened more than he spoke, his mind replaying the day's failures, vowing tomorrow would be different. He began to study his instructors the way he once studied professors, watching how they moved, how they gave commands, how they carried themselves with unshakable authority. Slowly, the lessons began to take root. He rose earlier, ran harder, pushed farther. His legs, once trembling, grew steady beneath him. His hands, once clumsy with the rifle, learned the rhythm of loading, aiming, firing until it felt like an extension of his body. Obstacles that had mocked him now yielded to his persistence. Each bruise became a badge, each ache a reminder that he was being remade. The instructors noticed. "Look at this one," one muttered after a long march. "Thought he'd be the first to crack. Now he's carrying others' packs." It was true. When a fellow recruit stumbled, the freshman didn't hesitate to shoulder the extra weight. When another froze at the sound of gunfire during exercises, he steadied him with a firm hand and a calm word. He never sought recognition. It wasn't in him to boast. But others began to look his way when things grew hard, drawn by the quiet steadiness that seemed to radiate from him. There was a moment small, almost forgettable, that revealed how far he had come. During a field exercise, the squad became disoriented in the woods. Orders tangled, tempers flared. Panic rippled through the group as daylight faded. The instructors, watching from the shadows, waited to see what would happen. It was the freshman who stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't bark. He simply pointed out the landmarks, recalled the map they had studied, and guided them back to camp with calm precision. When they returned, the instructor said nothing, only gave a curt nod. But that nod carried more weight than any shouted praise. The freshman lay awake that night, staring at the barracks ceiling. He wasn't the same boy who had once hidden behind books. He was changing, piece by piece, forged by mud and discipline, into something harder, sharper. Yet he still wondered, would it be enough when the real test came? Boot camp wasn't just about muscles and endurance. It was about breaking men down and rebuilding them. Some recruits cracked under the pressure, sent home in disgrace. Others hardened into brashness, mistaking arrogance for strength. But the freshman walked another path, quiet, deliberate, resilient. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the fastest. But he endured. Weeks stretched into months, and the transformation became undeniable. His uniform fit differently now, not because it had changed, but because he had. His shoulders were broader, his stance firmer. His once soft hands bore calluses from rifles and ropes. Even his eyes seemed altered, less wide with innocence, more steady with resolve. Letters from home arrived sporadically. His mother wrote of neighbors asking after him, of prayers whispered every Sunday. His father's letters were shorter, but pride slipped through the ink in careful words. "You've chosen a hard road. Walk it well." He carried those letters folded in his breast pocket, a reminder of where he had come from and why he could not fail. There were still nights when doubt gnawed at him. He would hear the snores of his fellow recruits, see their faces softened by sleep, and wonder which of them would live to see home again. He wondered if he would. But when the bugle called at dawn, he rose without hesitation, ready to face whatever the day demanded. The final test of training came with a grueling week-long field exercise, long marches, leave-fire drills, sleepless nights under freezing skies. By the end, some collapsed in exhaustion, others begged for mercy. The freshman, though his body screamed, pushed on. When a comrade twisted his ankle halfway through, he slung the man's arm over his shoulder and carried him mile after mile. He finished the course last, but he finished. And in the eyes of his instructors, that mattered more than coming first. When graduation day arrived, rows of recruits stood tall in pressed uniforms, faces leaner, eyes sharper. The freshman stood among them, no longer indistinguishable. He wasn't the loudest, nor the most decorated, but there was something in his bearing that made others glance his way. A steadiness, a quiet strength. The officer who had first noticed him on campus months before was there, clipboard in hand. As he passed down the line, his gaze lingered on the freshman. For a moment, recognition flickered. Then he gave the faintest of smiles. The freshman didn't smile back. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he understood now. Training was only the beginning. The real test lay ahead, across oceans, where mud and smoke and blood would demand everything from him. He had been a student, then a recruit. Now he was a soldier. And though he didn't yet know it, the war was waiting for the moment when he would prove he was the soldier they needed most. The ocean crossing had been long and uneasy. The transport ship groaned with every wave, carrying hundreds of young men who tried to mask their fear with bravado. Some played cards below deck, others wrote letters home, their pens scratching against paper in the dim light. But every so often, silence would settle, and eyes would drift toward the horizon, wondering what awaited them on foreign shores. The freshman, though he was hardly a freshman anymore, stood on deck most nights, his coat pulled tight against the salty wind. The stars above seemed distant, cold, untouched by human struggle. He gripped the railing, the photograph of his family tucked safely in his breast pocket, and asked himself the question none dared say aloud. Would he return to them? When the ship finally docked, the soldiers spilled into a world scarred by war. The air smelled of smoke and rubble. Roads were cratered. Buildings stood shattered like broken teeth. Civilians with hollow eyes watched silently as the Americans marched past, their presence both a beacon of hope and a reminder of destruction. For weeks, the soldiers drilled and waited. The tension was suffocating, days of preparation, nights of restless sleep, each man caught between dread and impatience. The freshman cleaned his rifle until it gleamed, memorized maps, and listened closely to every briefing. But no amount of preparation could erase the truth. Nothing in training could replicate the chaos of real battle. The order finally came one damp morning. Their unit was to move forward, relieve a group pinned down by enemy fire near a small village. The name of the village meant little to him, but he knew it would be etched into his memory forever. The march toward the front was slow, heavy with anticipation. The closer they drew, the more the distant rattle of gunfire grew into a roar. The smell of smoke thickened, mingling with the copper tongue of blood. And then, without warning, the world erupted. Mortar shells screamed overhead, exploding in showers of dirt and fire. The ground trembled beneath his boots. Bullets snapped through the air like angry hornets. Men shouted, cursed, screamed voices, swallowed by the deafening chaos. The freshman dropped to the ground, his rifle clutched tight, his body pressed into the mud. His heart pounded, his breath came ragged, but training surged through him like instinct. Crawl, keep low, find cover. His hands moved almost without thought, loading, aiming, firing. The first time he pulled the trigger, the recoil jolted through his shoulder. He saw a figure in the distance fall, though whether by his shot or another's, he could not know. The reality of it crashed into him. This was no exercise, no target range. These were men, flesh and bone, fighting for their lives. And he had just taken part in ending one. Fear clawed at him, but deeper than fear was resolve. Around him, comrades faltered. One froze, eyes wide, refusing to move until the freshman grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind a shattered wall. Another bled heavily from his leg, crying out for help, and the freshman pressed bandages into the wound, shouting for a medic while returning fire with steady aim. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into eternity. Each moment was a blur of smoke and fire, of dirt spraying into his face, of orders shouted and half heard. He fired until his rifle was hot, reloaded with trembling hands, then fired again. He moved not for glory, but for survival, for the men around him, for the faces in the photograph hidden in his pocket. There came a moment when the tide threatened to break them. Enemy fire rained relentless, pinning his squad down in a narrow street. Men ducked low, teeth gritted, fear written in every face. The lieutenant hesitated, unsure how to advance without losing more lives. And it was then that the freshman, this once ordinary student, rose to his feet. "Cover me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Before anyone could stop him, he dashed across the open ground, bullets whipping past. He vaulted over debris, dove behind a crumbled wall, and from there laid down suppressing fire. His boldness sparked the others into action. One by one, they moved forward under his cover, until the squad pushed through the choke point. When they reached the pinned unit, battered but alive, relief rippled through the exhausted men. The village was secured by nightfall, though at a terrible cost. The ground was littered with bodies, friend and foe alike. The cries of the wounded echoed long after the gunfire ceased. As darkness fell, the freshman sat against a wall, his uniform caked in mud and blood. His hands shook as he tried to clean his rifle. He could still hear the screams, still see the faces of the fallen. For the first time, he allowed himself to tremble. But amid the horror, something else stirred within him. He had not broken. When fear had threatened to paralyze him, he had acted. When others faltered, he had stood. And though he hated the blood on his hands, he understood what it meant now. He was not just surviving this war. He was becoming someone others could depend on. The officers noticed. They spoke of his composure under fire, his quick thinking, his refusal to abandon comrades. To the freshman, these words felt heavy, not flattering. Leadership was no metal to polish. It was a responsibility carved from sacrifice. That night, as he lay beneath the shattered roof of a half-destroyed farmhouse, the stars once again stretched cold and distant above. He fingered the photograph in his pocket, the edges worn from countless touches. He whispered a promise to it, not to seek glory, but to make sure the men around him saw home again. The battle for that village had ended, but the war was far from over. The freshman knew this was only the beginning of countless nights filled with fire and screams. Yet he also knew something else. When the bullets flew and chaos reigned, he could stand. And though he did not yet realize it, the soldier he was becoming would soon be the one they needed most. The weeks that followed the battle for the village blurred into an exhausting rhythm of marshes, firefights, and fleeting moments of rest. War had its own cruel calendar, measured not in days, but in survival. Each morning brought new orders, each night new scars etched into the hearts of the men. Yet in the shifting chaos, one thing became clear. The freshman, no longer just the boy who once carried books across a campus, was earning a reputation. It began with whispers. That's the one who crossed the street under fire. The kid saved Matthews from bleeding out. Soldiers talked in hushed tones, their words carrying through the ranks. At first, he tried to ignore it. He didn't feel like a hero. His hands still shook when he cleaned his rifle at night. His dreams were haunted by the faces of the fallen. But the whispers grew into something more: expectation. His squad mates began looking to him during patrols. They asked his opinion when maps were spread across the dirt. In the heat of battle, their eyes darted to him, seeking steady direction. And though he had never sought command, he found himself giving it. The lieutenant noticed too. One evening, after a particularly grueling march, the officer pulled him aside. "You keep your head when others lose theirs," the lieutenant said, his voice low but firm. "That's rare. Don't waste it." The words struck him harder than any shouted order ever had. Rare. Don't waste it. They echoed in his mind long after. A burden and a challenge rolled into one. Promotion didn't come overnight, but responsibility did. When a corporal was wounded and evacuated, the freshman stepped into his role temporarily. He expected resistance from the others after all. He was still young, barely older than many of them, with no more stripes on his sleeve than they wore. But instead, they followed. Not because of rank, but because when bullets flew, he moved first. Because when supplies ran short, he went without before asking others to. Because when men's spirits sagged, he found words, not lofty speeches, but plain, steady words that lifted them just enough to keep going. One bitter night in the forest, rain soaking through uniforms, morale crumbled like damp paper. Men cursed the mud, cursed the war, cursed their own aching bodies. The freshman, shivering like the rest, reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of his family. "This is why I fight," he said softly, passing it around. "Not for medals, not for glory. For them." For whom? The photo made its way through the circle, and though no one spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Each man thought of his own reason: the sweetheart waiting, the child yet unborn, the farm that needed tending. The grumbling stopped. By morning, they marched again, heads a little higher. The officers saw his effect on the men. A week later, his temporary role became permanent. Corporal's stripes were sewn onto his sleeve, the first visible sign of his climb. He accepted them not with pride, but with quiet resolve. For him, it wasn't about climbing a ladder. It was about shouldering the weight that needed to be carried. Combat grew fiercer as their unit pressed deeper into enemy territory. Villages smoldered, forests shook with artillery, and rivers ran red. Amid the carnage, the freshman distinguished himself again and again. During one ambush, when gunfire tore into the column and chaos threatened to scatter them, he crawled through mud and smoke to rally his men. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the din. Crawling, firing, dragging the wounded back with brute determination, he refused to let the squad break. They held until reinforcements arrived, and though the cost was high, their survival owed much to his stubborn defiance. Another time, when supplies dwindled and hunger gnawed at them, he organized a nighttime raid on enemy stockpiles. He led a small group through darkness, his every step calculated, his every whisper precise. They returned with food, ammunition, and medical kits that kept the unit fighting for days longer than expected. By then, the whispers had grown into certainty. The men didn't just respect him, they trusted him with their lives. But with trust came loneliness. The closer he rose to leadership, the more he felt a gap opening between himself and the others. They joked and laughed around fires, sharing memories of home, while he often sat apart, maps spread across his lap, planning the next move. He missed the ease of being just one of them, of fading into the group. But he knew the truth. Someone had to carry the weight. Promotions came again, slowly, each one heavier than the last. Sergeant now. More men under his watch. More lives dependent on his judgment. The responsibility pressed down on him, like the helmet he wore, always present, always heavy. There were moments when doubt crept in. Nights when he stared at his reflection in the dark water of the stream, wondering who he had become. Was he still the boy who once dreamed of books and futures? Or was he now only the soldier the war had forged? Yet when dawn came and orders were given, he never hesitated. One evening, after a brutal day of fighting that left their ranks thinned and spirits broken, a young recruit approached him. The boy couldn't have been more than 18, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Sergeant," he whispered, "I don't think I can do this. I'm not strong enough." The freshman, though he carried stripes now, though his hair was streaked with grime and exhaustion, looked at the boy and saw himself months ago. He placed a hand on the recruit's shoulder. "None of us think we're strong enough," he said gently. "But strength isn't about what you feel before the fight. It's about what you do when it comes. And I've seen you fight. You're stronger than you know." The boy straightened, nodded, and the next day fought with renewed grit. It was a small victory, but for the sergeant, it was a reminder that leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about believing in others when they couldn't believe in themselves. As the campaign dragged on, the soldier who had once been a college freshman became something more in the eyes of his unit. He was no longer just one of them. He was the one they turned to when darkness threatened to consume them. His rise wasn't marked by fanfare or ceremony, but by mud, sweat, and sacrifice. And though the war had many more battles to throw their way, it was clear this young man, once overlooked, had risen to be not just a survivor, but a leader. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted it. But when war demanded someone to stand, it was him who rose. And the higher he climbed, the clearer it became. This soldier was on a path toward a mission that would define everything. The winter of that year was bitter and unrelenting. Snow fell in heavy curtains, muffling the sounds of war, but never silencing them. Smoke still curled from shattered villages, and the frozen earth bore the scars of countless battles. By then, the soldier, once the anonymous freshman on a campus lawn, was no longer just another man in uniform. He wore his stripes with quiet gravity, his name spoken with respect by the men who marched at his side. But even hardened soldiers could sense when a storm was coming. And when the orders came down, every man felt it in his bones. Their mission was unlike anything before. Intelligence had revealed a heavily fortified enemy stronghold guarding a vital supply route. Taking it would cut the enemy's lifeline, crippling their advance. Failing, however, meant disaster not just for their unit, but for the thousands depending on those supplies to keep fighting. The lieutenant laid out the plan under the dim glow of lanterns. Maps spread across the table, fingers traced lines of assault. "We go in before dawn," he said, his voice taut. "They'll expect us to hit head on, but we'll flank under cover of night. It won't be easy. Most of us won't come back. But if we succeed—" He let the words hang. They all knew what success meant. When the meeting ended, the soldier lingered, studying the maps long after others drifted off to find what little rest they could. His eyes traced the terrain, memorizing every line, every contour. He wasn't afraid of the challenge itself. What gnawed at him was the weight of the men looking to him now, men who would follow him into the jaws of hell simply because he said, "Forward." That night, sleep refused him. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the photograph of his family warm in his hand. He whispered their names under his breath, then tucked the photo back into his pocket. He would carry it into battle, as always, not as a charm of luck, but as a promise. Before dawn, they moved. Snow crunched under their boots, muffled by layers of frost. Breath misted in the air. Darkness cloaked their approach, the only light the pale shimmer of the moon. The soldier walked near the front, his senses sharp, every step measured. Behind him, the men moved with steady faith. The first gunfire erupted, just as the horizon began to pale. Flashes burst from enemy lines, cutting through the quiet. Bullets tore the air, splintering trees, sparking off frozen stone. Shouts rose, commands barked, and in seconds the night was swallowed by chaos. "Move!" the soldier roared, pushing his men forward. They dove into ditches, scrambled over ridges, the ground shaking as artillery pounded around them. Explosions lit the snow like lightning, showers of dirt and fire raining down. Pinned by machine gun nests, their advance faltered. Fear rippled through the line, men ducking low, waiting for orders. The lieutenant shouted, but his words were drowned in the thunder of fire. And then instinct took over. The soldier crawled to the front, surveying the field through the haze of smoke. He spotted the nest well fortified, spitting death across their path. They couldn't advance until it was silenced. Slowly, he turned to his squad. "Cover me." Before anyone could argue, he darted from cover, sprinting low across the frozen ground. Bullets whipped past, churning the snow into bloody slush. He dove behind a broken wall, then moved again, inch by inch, until he was close enough to see the enemy faces through the nest's slit. With a flash of determination, he hurled a grenade, ducking as it exploded in a deafening roar. The nest went silent, smoke billowing. His men seized the opening, surging forward with renewed vigor. The fight raged on for hours. House by house, trench by trench, they clawed their way through the stronghold. The soldier led from the front, dragging the wounded to safety, rallying men when their courage faltered, pushing forward when retreat seemed the only option. His voice cut through the storm. "We hold together. Forward." In one brutal exchange, they were cornered in a narrow street, enemy fire raining from windows above. Panic threatened to split them apart, but the soldier stood in the open, firing steadily, shouting orders until his men regained their ground. His courage wasn't reckless, it was deliberate, a beacon in the madness. By dusk, the stronghold was theirs. Smoke curled from shattered walls, the cries of the wounded mixing with the crackle of fire. The cost had been terrible, too many men lay still in the snow, but the supply route was cut. The mission, against all odds, had succeeded. Exhausted, bloodied, the soldier slumped against a wall, his rifle across his knees. Around him, men whispered in awe. "He never faltered, carried us through. That's why we made it." But he didn't hear their praise. His eyes were fixed on the fallen, his heart heavy with the knowledge that leadership meant carrying both victory and loss. Later, as reports were written and commendations prepared, the higher officers debated medals and honors. But among the men, there was no debate. In the crucible of that mission, when death loomed and hope seemed lost, it had been the steady courage of one soldier, the boy who once sat in a college classroom, that had held them together. That night, as he lay beneath the fractured roof of a ruined barn, the photograph pressed against his chest, he understood something profound. This mission had not only changed the course of the war, it had changed him. He was no longer simply enduring the fight. He was shaping it. And though he could not know it yet, history would remember this mission as the moment when a freshman became the soldier they needed most. The war ended slowly, almost imperceptibly, as months of fighting gave way to tentative peace. The battlefield was still scarred, the forests pockmarked with craters, the rivers tainted with mud and blood. Cities lay in ruin, the echo of artillery replaced by the groan of rebuilding and the quiet murmur of those who survived. The soldier, once a college freshman unaware of the world's demands, walked among the remnants of villages, carrying his pack and the weight of countless memories. He had returned from battle, not unscathed, not untouched. His uniform bore stains that no laundry could remove. His hands still carried calluses, and his heart was stitched with invisible scars from the friends he had lost. Yet through it all, he moved with a quiet steadiness that had carried him through the darkest hours of the war. Letters arrived from families whose sons, brothers, and fathers had been saved by his courage. Soldiers he had led wrote of gratitude, of hope rekindled in moments when they thought all was lost. Yet the soldier himself never sought recognition. He did not boast of missions accomplished or battles survived. He simply carried forward, as he always had, moving with purpose and resolve. In time, the medals arrived. A small chest of honor, awarded not just for bravery, but for leadership, for the ability to inspire men to act when terror threatened to paralyze them. The soldier accepted them quietly, placing them beside the photograph of his family. He did not wear them for show. They were reminders of the responsibility he had borne, and the lives he had vowed to protect. Back home, the world seemed both familiar and foreign. The streets of his town carried the smell of earth and smoke, the laughter of children who had not known the horrors he had witnessed. His parents waited, older now, faces lined with the worry and hope of months spent apart. The reunion was quiet. No words could capture the complexity of what he had endured, but the embrace, tight and lingering, spoke volumes. He returned to college, to the classrooms and libraries he had once walked as an ordinary freshman. The world inside these walls seemed impossibly small compared to the battlefields abroad, yet he found solace there. Books, once merely a way to pass the hours, became a refuge, a place to reconcile the chaos of war with the rhythm of thought and reflection. Even in peace, the lessons of combat lingered. He noticed the subtle details, the small acts of courage in everyday life. A man helping a neighbor clear debris from his yard. A teacher guiding a student through confusion and doubt. He realized that bravery was not confined to battlefields. It existed wherever someone stood steady in the face of fear, wherever someone acted with compassion and resolve. He also knew that the legacy of a soldier was not measured solely by medals or recognition, but by the lives touched, the trust earned, and the courage inspired. Young men who had once followed him in the chaos of war now looked to him for guidance, not only as a soldier, but as a mentor, a reminder that ordinary beginnings could lead to extraordinary deeds. In time, he began to speak to new generations not with grand speeches, but with quiet lessons drawn from experience. At veteran gatherings, in classrooms, and at local ceremonies, he shared what he had learned, the importance of steadiness, of selflessness, of courage grounded in purpose. His words were simple, yet profound, carrying the weight of authenticity born from lived experience. And though he never sought fame, the community came to honor him. Streets were named, plaques displayed, and young men trained in local militias looked to his story as a blueprint for courage. Yet he remained humble, insisting that the true heroes were those who stood beside him, who acted in moments when panic might have claimed them. Years passed. Children were born, towns rebuilt, and life moved forward. Yet the soldier carried the memories of war, as he always had neither a burden to weigh him down, nor a trophy to display. They were part of him, inseparable from the man he had become. He often returned to the old photograph, the one that had accompanied him through training, across oceans, and into the fires of battle. He would sit quietly, tracing the familiar lines of his family's faces, and reflect on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple choice, to step forward when history called. In those reflections, he understood the full measure of his life. He had been an ordinary freshman, easily overlooked, quietly navigating a world he barely understood. Yet when the nation demanded more than ordinary, he rose. When men faltered, he stood. When darkness threatened to claim hope, he became a beacon. The war had shaped him, but it did not define him. He defined the lessons of its steadfastness, courage, and leadership through quiet example. Generations who never knew him personally would hear his story, and they would learn that heroism is often born from ordinary beginnings, from the refusal to shrink when confronted by fear, from the choice to act when inaction seemed safer. In the final chapter of his life, he walked the streets of his hometown, now rebuilt, now vibrant. Children ran past, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Adults greeted him with nods and smiles, some recalling stories of courage and sacrifice they had heard in youth. And though he carried no illusions of grandeur, he recognized that his life, once a quiet path through ordinary days, had left a mark that would endure. He paused by the old oak tree where he had once scribbled in his notebook as a college freshman. The bark was scarred with age, but the branches reached skyward as they had decades ago. He placed a hand against it, feeling the rough texture, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. From that place of solitude and memory, he whispered a thought meant for no one but himself. I was enough. Enough to stand when others faltered. Enough to lead when fear pressed down. Enough to carry hope when the world seemed lost. The soldier who had once been a freshman ordinary, quiet, unsure had become extraordinary, not through desire, but through the relentless choice to rise. History remembered him not merely for his acts, but for the proof he offered that courage, leadership, and integrity could grow from the most unassuming beginnings. And as he walked away from the tree, toward the life that had waited patiently while war reshaped him, he carried with him the final truth of his journey, that heroism is not born in the absence of fear, but in the quiet steadiness of one who moves forward anyway.